Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We'll be recording this webinar to help others review it in the future. So please mute your lines if you haven't done so to minimize background noise. My name is Vivian Lee, and I am the Plant Powered Metro New York Bronx organizer. Plant Powered Metro New York is a community-based organization committed to our collective health empowerment through whole food plant-based nutrition, which is an evidence-based approach to nutrition that can prevent, treat, and even reverse chronic illness. And while we normally prefer to do live sessions to build community around health and nutrition, we're offering this program as a part of a web series during the season of COVID-19. And this is actually one of the 3 cooking demos that we have to highlight Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So welcome. We're so glad that you come to connect with us today and to find community despite our social distancing. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box and let us know where you're from and what you hope to learn today. As a reminder, again, please mute your lines. And if you have any questions, we will address them after the demonstration, or if there's time in between, then maybe we can open 1 or 2 questions during the demonstration as well. So today's program features Varun Ponmudi. He is the founder of Aaya's Table, which offers home-cooked, whole food, plant-based cooking services and nutrition services as well. And today he will be demonstrating an Indian home-cooked dish called Korma, and I will let him
As long as
introduce
you're happy
himself.
with what you got, it's all good!
Yeah.
Exclamation point.
So Varun, take it away. It's yours.
Sure thing. Well, welcome everyone. So for those of you who are familiar with Indian food, korma is one of those staples, kind of like the curry. It's a little creamier variation. It goes really well with like a roti or a whole wheat rice, brown rice or a whole wheat roti. And I'd like to think that it's one of the easier dishes to prepare. It's, the ingredients list that we sent out, it does look a little daunting, a little extensive. But as you'll see today, we have an hour scheduled. I don't imagine that will be longer than like 35 minutes maybe. It's really just a matter of putting all the ingredients together. So I've got us started with a lot of the spices that we're going to be using. And what I'll show you here is one of the main ones, which is something called garam masala. So this is actually a spice blend, and it's probably one of the most useful in Indian cooking. It's in a lot of variety of dishes, and it's really a mix of a lot of the ones that you may have already heard. So coriander, it's ground coriander, cumin, pepper, a little bit of cinnamon, nutmeg. And a simple way to make this is actually to mix cumin with allspice, or you can individually toast up whole spices and then grind them together and create a mix like this. Just for ease, and because this is in the kitchen, I am using this today. I think what we'll do is probably schedule another one for the future where we can show a demonstration of us actually putting the whole spices together and creating something like this, or maybe a chai tea. So getting all those spices nice and cooked up and aromatic so that you can use them fresh. So in most cases, grinding a whole spice into something like this fresh is the ideal scenario. In this case, we'll work with what we have. In addition to the garam masala, we have a few other spices that are you've all probably heard of. This is a mix of curry powder. I also have a little bit of turmeric in there. So this is what you see in the recipe. I've just portioned them out so that it'll be quick and easy to put together. This is something I found these, I think it was at Target or something, these little bowls. They're extremely useful for cooking, and you have a lot of spices, so that you don't have to be constantly measuring and washing your measuring spoons out. I'm going to bring this up a little closer. I'm not sure if you can see this that well, the coloration, but in addition, so the yellowmost spice is turmeric, and I actually have 2 different types of curry powder. And the reason for that is, one is I would call authentic. This is stuff that you can get in it. It's not in a curry powder jar. This is in a different jar, but this is brought in from India. So this is from an Indian store. If you go to an Asian market, highly recommend doing so when you're thinking about cooking any sort of ethnic food. A lot of this, the quality of spices tend to be more flavorful, larger variety as well. Versus, again, a very good brand. This is something I picked up just at your traditional retail grocery store, and it's the same curry powder. But when you look at it, it's a slightly different formulation. So curry powder, again, kind of like the gram masala, is a mix of spices. It includes some turmeric. It includes the curry leaf that's toasted up and ground. So the way that it's really put together does vary from place to place. So if you find a flavor or a brand that you like, that's one to stick with. For me, it really winds up being the authentic flavor from South India. So going to those traditional stores, those ethnic stores, tends to be a really good trip. Try and buy a lot of things. You also find a lot of vegetables you wouldn't normally find in a typical grocery store as well. Also have a little bit of coriander, again, something we're all familiar with, and a little bit of cumin. Something that's not on the recipe because I couldn't find in the grocery store and I didn't have a chance, but I did have some at home, is basically a roasted chickpea. This is what I'm going to be using today. I think for those of you who are able to find chickpea flour, that's going to be a great alternative. If you don't have chickpea flour, something like almond flour is also going to be a really good option to help thicken up the curry. So I'm going to start by, I already started, excuse me, taking a couple of cashews, raw cashews, and putting them in water to soak. So the first phase of making this curry is going to be, this korma is really going to get this thick kind of slurry, this paste all together. And it's going to be a combination of garlic, ginger, those cashews, and a chili pepper as well. So I'm using this is actually just a jalapeno pepper. I couldn't find the green chili peppers that I wanted in the store. This will do the job. In my case, a lot of the heat is coming from the curry powder as well, so I'm quite fine with this. Regular yellow onion. I find that these are very handy for a lot of Indian dishes. They have an ability to kind of, especially when you're water sauteing, I think they hold up really well to caramelizing on without the oil. So I tend to go with these. So I'm just going to start up by cutting off some onion, tossing everything into a blender that I'm putting together now. So I'm going to do just about a half an onion. I'm going to reserve some of it for a water saute. In a lot of other korma recipes, you would probably not do the water saute. Since we're not using oil, I am finding that this separate step tends to be kind of a useful option. So I'm just going to peel this and throw this into a blender, which I have right up here. And so yeah, if you have any questions about the spice mixes that we're using or any other things that you've seen in the recipe, you're welcome to type them in. I can answer them while I'm finishing up this prep here. So since these are all going into the blender, I'm really not overly concerned with getting the onion chopped up too finely. Likewise, I've got 3 cloves of garlic that I'm going to do the same. I'm just going to open them up and then pop them right in there. One of the tricks that one of our chefs, our kitchen coaches, showed me to open up the peel on a garlic clove is to remove where the stem would be and then squash the garlic before you remove all of the casing, and it kind of just pops out, which you'll see right here. Now, just the end of it there, and as soon as I bring that blade down and kind of squish it down, the shell just kind of pops off and all that skin. Again, throwing this straight into the blender. I'm going to do that a few more times here.
Again, if anyone has questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box.
Yeah. So while we're doing this, if we don't have any questions, I'll tell you a little bit about the history of the korma. Like a lot of Indian food, it is primarily vegetarian. There are alternatives that use meat, but vegetarian doesn't mean whole foods, plant-based. Indian food, as delicious as it is, tends to use a ton of ghee, which is a clarified butter. Korma in particular also uses a lot of coconut oil, coconut milk in thickening, adding the creaminess. So everything we're doing here today, no ghee, no butter, no coconut oil. So all the alternatives I'll be showing you, I'll discuss as we go through. Next to last thing to add to the blender, a little bit of ginger. So ginger is one of those things, very strong. It has skin on it. I'm actually going to take a little bit of the skin off, but I'm going to leave the majority of it on. I will be cutting this up just into smaller pieces before I throw it into the blender. So you can see I didn't take all the skin off. It's going to add some nice flavor to this. Last but not least, this pepper here. So depending on what your spice preferences are, I'm going to seed this. So I'm going to take out the seeds and put in just the outside of the pepper.
Varun, as far as the dish that you're presenting today, are there other varieties of korma?
Yeah, so korma is kind of like, if you consider something like a chili, everyone makes it differently, and certainly regionally there are a lot of differences. So if you think of some, like North India, for instance, it has to do with the spices that are available. And this is really, you're just getting into the history of food and cuisine and what kind of spices were available in different regions. So for instance, a North Indian korma would probably be a little heavier with the cumin versus the curry flavor itself, curry leaves those are a little bit more native to the southern part of India, which is actually where I'm from. The flavor profile will also be a little bit different. I would say that southern Indian food tends to be a little bit more spicy, a little bit more heat, versus other regions where they'd probably add a little bit of sweetness, a little bit of sugar or something to soften that. All right, so I have everything that I need in terms of the vegetables in my Vitamix here. Last step I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly drain this water. So usually I like to rinse the cashews and then fill them with water. I neglected to do so, so I'm not going to use the same water when I blend this up together. So I'm just going to drain them real quick. This is a cup of cashews. That's going straight into the blender here. And then I'm going to add a half a cup of water.
Varun, for the cashews, how long did you soak them for?
So I did about 10 minutes in a hot water, so just a tap hot water. You're welcome to boil them. Depending on the type of blender you have, you may not even need to soak the cashews up. One of the things I'm going to add now, for instance, is these roasted chickpeas. So I'm adding them in this step now because I have them. If you're using chickpea flour, you're going to add them later on in the process as we're cooking. And something like this, I'm not even soaking at all. So same with the cashews. And I'll tilt this over a little bit so you can see the blender. And we'll prepare for a lot of noise. So we're going to basically look for a really thick slurry here. So like a thick paste. So you can actually, all those spices, so the garlic and the ginger flavor and the onion really coming out. You can't smell it, but it's a nice smell, not something that tastes great right now. But yeah, this is basically what we're going to be using. And, you know, for that thickening agent when we're making this korma here. So,
Varun, we have a question
yep.
from one of our registrants. He's asking if you could add vegetable broth to add flavor.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. When we're doing the cooking, we're going to need to water down this korma. So at that point, I'm actually going to use vegetable broth. Water works just as well. I use the vegetable broth just for that reason. It adds a little bit of a distinct flavor. And you can do the same thing in this stage. I would say that I've never tried making this, this paste with vegetable broth. So in terms of how that affects the final dish, I'm not sure, not so sure. But when you're putting in, right, fresh chili, fresh garlic and ginger and onion, you're not going to be lacking in any flavor there. So I've got 2 gold potatoes, 2 yellow potatoes here. This is for the actual korma. And again, I think one of the questions earlier, right, was different types of kormas. The choice in vegetables that you use, anything and everything that you can think of. So today I'm going to be using green beans. If you have peas, you're welcome to throw that in there instead. Potato and cauliflower are 2 of my staples with any korma, and that's a personal preference. But if that's not something that you're a fan of, then absolutely, by all means, take them out. The potato and cauliflower in particular are really going to soak up that flavor. So I love them in this dish. And I also have some carrots that I have cut up. So this is 1 large carrot. So again, the volume is really, it goes down to how thick do you want your korma versus how watery and runny. In terms of size, cutting them into basically like a 1/2 centimeter cubes. I find that that works well for the amount of time that we're going to be actually cooking them on the stovetop. But again, larger, smaller, whatever your preference is. So right after we're done here, we're going to do a little work with the spices. So one of the beautiful things about spices is it's kind of like an art form. You throw them in at different times to achieve different flavor profiles. So with something like a korma, you know, this variety of spices, each has unique flavors. So by adding them in early, toasting them a little bit, and then adding them in early, we're going to let them blend really nicely together. With something like a dal, you usually add it towards some of the spices you would be adding towards the end. And it's more of a garnish than anything. It winds up being like a nice potent flavor. So cooking them for a longer duration like we'll do today is going to mellow out some of the flavors.
Varun, instead of the yellow potato or larger potato, could you use a smaller, thin-skinned potatoes?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, again, this is one of those where you can get creative with the vegetables that you use, and the potato is no exception to that. I like these guys. They do cook nice and quickly, so that, you know, that's one help. If you're using a potato that does take a little longer to cook, maybe something like a russet, you can always steam or heat up the potato a little bit, cook it prior, just a little bit before you actually throw it into the pan. So that's an option as well for vegetables that take longer. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to add the carrots, the cauliflower, and the potato together first, since those will be taking the longest time to cook. And then the green beans I'll be adding later on. All right, so cauliflower, I did wind up cutting a few minutes ahead of time. So I'm going to move us over towards the stovetop, and we're going to start warming up the spices. I'm just using a traditional non-stick pan here. Heating up the spices, traditionally in a korma or an Indian dish, you're going to be doing a process called tempering. And that's where you use basically a high heat to open up the flavors in the spices. This is done both with spices that are whole, but also when they're ground up. And it also includes garlic. As part of that whole foods approach, we are avoiding any oil. In India itself, I would say that the oil that they did use was typically something like grapeseed oil, which has a much higher temperature. So you can heat it up much higher, which again actually helps with releasing the flavors. And if for whatever reason if you decided to use oil in restaurants, a lot of times they'll use an oil like that, which brings out the flavor more than something like olive oil, which is really not a good cooking oil for Indian food in particular. That said, doing a water saute or even just a dry roast with the spices, we are not going to get all of the same flavor that you would be when you're using oil. And that's just a fact that I would compare it to maybe like baking potatoes versus deep frying them. There's, a difference in flavor, but in terms of how good the dish is when it comes together, considering we have so many ingredients, it doesn't really feel like we're losing much. So I'm going to turn the pan on here. This is going to require a little bit of attention because my key goal here is to not burn the spices. So I may quiet down for a minute just to make sure I do that. If you wind up burning your spices, to discard everything and restart. You can't really make up for burnt spices, unfortunately. So in this step here, typically when you're using whole spices, you're going to put everything in together. You're not going to put everything in together. You're going to start with the spices that burn quickest. You're going to end with the spices that burn quickest. Here, everything is already ground, so it's kind of in the same place. So make sure I have all my tools handy. I'm just going to spread it out. And as soon as I start, it's already very aromatic, but as soon as it starts becoming a little bit more intense, I'm going to remove it from the heat. And it will continue to cook. And that flavor actually, you can't tell with the color, but it has changed. It's a little bit more complex right now. So I know that I'm almost at the end here of what I need to do. If you're wary of doing something like this, you could absolutely skip this step and put the spices in with your mix. But the flavor will be a little different. It won't be quite as, melted together the way that it is going to be here. That chemical process by adding the heat here individually before anything else does make a significant difference. So yeah, now it's like the spice is has a little bit of a sweetness and it's kind of blended together. So before I was able to smell all the spices a little bit more independently. I'll leave it on for another second before I move it off here. If you're using whole spices, what you would see is things pop. You would see them crackle. And the key is really, you don't want the spices to brown overly. That means that it's a little bit too late. Okay. So this next step is not required. It's kind of just one that I've found to add a little bit more flavor. Again, we're talking about a little bit of that tempering flavor or blooming, I think is another phrase that is often used. So kind of to compensate, I reserved part of that onion. So I'm just going to chop this up traditionally, dice it up, and then I'm going to be water sauteing this with some of the extra garlic and ginger that I have left over. So, when I used to cook with oil, I probably was a little bit more lax with how finely I diced up the onion. Nowadays, I try and go as small pieces as possible.
Varun, we have another question. How much of the roasted chickpeas were used in the blender? And can we use the canned version instead of the flour?
So like traditional canned chickpeas?
When you put it in the blender, you
Yep.
use the chickpea flour, correct? To thicken?
Yep. That's a dehydrated chickpea. So that's something I wouldn't use like your traditional chickpea from the can. I use a tablespoon exactly. And again, that's one of those that, if you're looking for a brand like Goya, it was definitely going to have it. In my case, again, it was from an Indian grocery store. Instead of using that, again, I'm gonna show you when and where to do it. And in the recipe, this is the way we laid it out, is you can use chickpea flour later on. And again, kind of like with the spices, instead of adding it right to the korma, you can toast it up a little bit the same way we just demonstrated here before putting it in. I also have a bag of almond flour, which I'm reserving in case I feel like my curry is not thick enough. I'll be using this because I didn't have any chickpea flour. I couldn't find any in the grocery store.
We have another question. Are roasted chickpeas the same as split peas?
I'm sorry, one more time?
Are roasted chickpeas the same as split peas?
So yeah, I'll show you. So I'll show you so unfortunately I don't have the bag with me. So again, this is going to be what it looks like. So it's a little bit different. It's not a leftover prices, like a split pea. I have roasted them, like if I were, you can actually smell these. So I'll even show you. They'll just kind of like crumble in your hand.
Varun, I'm sorry. Could you face the camera? It's hard to hear the audio.
This chickpea, having been roasted, and yeah, it's basically a split pea. It is going to like crumble in your fingers, so you definitely want it as a roasted version. What I'm doing here, as I was saying, is I just have a little bit of extra ginger and garlic, as well as that onion, which I'm going to be doing as part of the water saute. Again, this is a completely optional step. Instead of using whole ginger and garlic, you can also use ginger and garlic paste that you find in a bottle. So I think a whole clove is about a half a teaspoon of the garlic paste, something along those lines. Usually the bottle will tell you.
So the question, are the split peas different from, so garbanzo beans and chickpeas are the same, that I can confidently answer. Are the split peas different? I think Varun answered that question.
Yeah. So
roasted.
Yeah, the split peas are, I believe, a different species. I think they're related, but yeah, definitely not the same compared to the garbanzo. All right, so I'm going to bring us back to the pan. And as far as actual work, that's about it. The rest is just putting the stuff together. So I'm heating this pan up to a medium heat. I have some vegetable broth. So let's start with a touch of this. So that's about a quarter cup, maybe a little less. For anyone that has extra spices and wants to do something like this, I have fresh cardamoms. This is something that you're welcome to add. I'm just going to throw it on here. Again, that's not a requirement. It's just going to add a little bit more flavor. It's something that is again part of that like tempering process. Typically, this is going to be done with like a clarified butter, oil. Doing it in vegetable broth or water is actually very taboo. I think you could ask any Indian chef, traditional Indian chef, they would yell at you for trying to heat up spices this way, but we're gonna do it. Another thing you can add here is the bay leaf. Again, these are optional. They're gonna add a little bit of a distinct flavor. It's something that I prefer. Something like a bay leaf, really you shouldn't be adding more than one or even half. Very strong flavor, especially when you have all these other spices.
So in this case, a little bit really does go a long way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'm just gonna let that go for another like 30 seconds or so, and I will get this paste ready. So one thing with not using oil, you can't quite step away from the stovetop for as long as you'd like. Have to be a little bit more vigilant. So before I put that paste in, so this is starting to drop. And yeah, I can start smelling the spices a little bit here. This is that onion and garlic we chopped up. As garlic and ginger especially is going to start to burn really quickly, so before it does that, I'll add a little bit more vegetable broth in here. And really the goal here is we're taking like mini steps to try and get close to the flavor release that you get from tempering. Now, taking that extra minute to toast up the spices goes a long way in that sense.
Does Varun, does tempering always require oil?
Traditionally, that's usually what they talk about is either something like a grapeseed oil or ghee is usually what is the other big one that's used. So that's the clarified butter. That chemical reaction that you're getting, it's basically the fat that's causing the spice to release some of the aroma and some of its nutrition as well. You don't get the same effect with water. And part of, again, going back to the type of oil you're using, so olive oil is not as effective in doing so. But something like grapeseed oil, you can actually get to a really hot temperature that more effectively does that. Tempering, I believe it's used in another phrase in baking, so not at all the same.
Right, I've heard of tempering chocolate.
Yeah, not quite the same here.
Yeah.
And you'll start to see, the onion is starting to brown. I've managed to not burn the garlic and the ginger yet, so I'm happy with this. And then probably the next step is the hardest thing for me personally, which is getting as much of this out of the blender as possible. I feel like I always leave behind a ton of whatever I'm blending up. So let's see how well I'm able to do that today.
We have a question. The chana dal, that is also chickpeas, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So they're not lentils. They're different from lentils.
Right. Yeah. Chana dal is your traditional like garbanzo.
Okay. So the beans that you're using here, can you clarify for us?
So wait, are you talking about like the chana dal as in like the dish?
Yes. The Rabbi Joy, do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Hi.
Okay, so I'm confused about what these are, and
You have the right thing in hand.
are these, when you talk about roasted chickpeas, is this what you're talking about?
Can you bring them up to the camera a little bit higher, please? Yep, that's them. That's them. So I think when you said chana, I was thinking of the dish, which is your garbanzo bean curry, basically. But yes, the ones that you have, that is exactly what I was using. And there's a roasted version, and that's what you would ideally want to use, or you could roast them yourselves, bake them in the oven for a little bit, or even pan roast them for a couple of minutes before using them.
Okay, so these are dry, so you just put them in a pan
Those
and
you
roast
would
them?
need to soak first.
You have to soak them, then roast them.
Yeah, and that soak is usually, again, kind of like beans, overnight, a few hours at the very least.
Okay, okay. But these are not garbanzos,
Right.
right? These are not garbanzo beans.
Yeah, so it's more of a lentil type.
Great. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. I appreciate it.
There are so many different names for them too. Sometimes I confuse myself, but yeah, they're very distinct.
Okay,
But then when you're talking about chana as a dish, that is a chickpea. It's still, I guess it's still the same family.
okay. Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So what we've done here is we just started adding that paste here. I'm going to start adding these spices in slowly and mixing it in. You're going to be really careful again with no oil. You have to be very mindful not to let this burn. You can add just a little bit at a time of this vegetable broth. If you wind up adding too much vegetable broth, that's totally fine. That's why, in the case that I do that, I have a little bit of this almond flour that I'm going to throw in if needed. And you can see I'm not adding all the spices at once. I want to make sure that I'm mixing it up well. I will say again, one big advantage in having toasted these spices earlier, we're not forced to cook them for as long in the dish. So for anyone who's ever tried to cook Indian food or any dish with a lot of spices, undercooking spices winds up giving you kind of a gritty taste. It's almost like a spicy stand flavor to it. And taking time to really cook food well, something like chili, for instance, it helps the spices release a lot of their flavor. So undercooking spice is definitely not something you want to do. Toasting them in advance, really good way to make sure, kind of a safety net for us. And you can see this is really like thick and creamy, so I probably won't be needing to add a whole lot of almond flour, if any. The rest of my spice. I'm going to add some more vegetable broth. I'm just eyeballing it here. I know there's an amount in the recipe. Again, go with whatever consistency that you're looking for.
Is that the similar consistency we would expect if we were to use, if we're using coconut milk?
Yeah, so coconut milk is going to be a little bit watery. And actually, in a lot of traditional kormas, they are going to use something like that chickpea, the roasted chickpea, to add some grittiness to it. So the creaminess, I would say, like the cashews give you two things. They give you a little bit of the creaminess that you would get, using a coconut milk, but adding that chickpea in there as well. And that's the additional texture that you want and that you're getting from here. So I realized I didn't cut these tomatoes up, and I want to add them to this mix. So I'm going to add a little water, chop them up real quick. If you don't want to use fresh tomatoes, you can also just use a can of roasted or diced crushed tomatoes, what have you. The fire roasted tomatoes are totally fine as well. They'll just impart a little bit of a different flavor to it. But tomato in Indian food is a really great way to break up some of the spice and give you a nice kind of additional moisture. I'm just going to kind of hand crush these in here. Add a little bit more vegetable broth. Again, the amount of tomatoes, I'm going to use just about a tomato and a half, more or less, depending on the texture you're looking for. And after we let this simmer for a little bit, we'll get a chance to taste it. And then you can see if you want to cut down on some of the spice a little bit, or in which case you add some more tomatoes or vegetable broth. throwing in the carrots now, and I'll start stirring everything together. I think based on my dish size and what I have, I'm probably just going to use about a half of the cauliflower head that I cut up. I'll snack on the rest at some point. Last but not least, potatoes. I'm just going to stir this all in together. Just add a little bit more vegetable broth just to help this along.
I wish we could smell that.
I know, it smells pretty good. You know, and we're going to basically let this simmer for about 10 minutes or so, 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'm going to add the green beans. I actually need a lot more vegetable broth here. So I've added just about a cup and a half of vegetable broth. I think after this cooks a little longer, I'll see if I want any more in here. But yeah, you'll start to see that color that you would expect with the korma. So, you know, having put in all those spices, it's still got a little bit of a light creaminess to it. And that's from that cashew mix that we made earlier.
Is this a complete dish on its own, or do you serve it with grains?
I would typically serve this with the grain. I think I've never had it on its own unless out of necessity. If there's a little extra on the plate, we'll always finish that by itself. But yeah, over rice or with some sort of bread is usually the go-to. I find that this in particular is really good with with brown rice. So that's what I'm going to be serving it on today.
We have also had Varun demonstrate how to make roti. So if you'd like to check that out, we have our video on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to view that for the recipe.
It's so simple. It's just a little bit of water, whole wheat flour. And that's the beauty of rotis in particular, is it's always been whole wheat flour. It doesn't work as well with a refined version. So what we're going to do here is we're going to basically turn the heat down and let this simmer for 10 minutes. And after that, and let me actually tilt up. So we're kind of at the end of the demo. So we're going to simmer for 10 minutes, uncovered. And then I have green beans, which I'll pull out. I'm just going to be adding basically about a half a cup of green beans. We'll add a little bit of salt. I'll taste the korma, see if it's to my liking, and then we'll let it simmer for another 15 minutes. So just about 25 minutes total, and then it'll be ready to serve.
Excellent. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask during this time? Feel free to write them in the chat box.
Just about 2 cups. I had made this the other day, so the recipe is going to make a pretty significant serve.
I've also included the video where Varun shows how to make the flatbread. So feel free to bookmark that and watch it later at your convenience.
Yeah, and if you haven't set a timer, really what we're doing now is letting the vegetables tenderize and get properly cooked. And we're letting for the spices also to impart some of their flavor. So if you haven't set a timer, poke a fork in the vegetables, that potato especially, see if it's tender enough. and then you can throw in the green beans, let it cook a little bit longer. Peas the same way. I would add it at the end.
It looks absolutely delicious. I really wish I could taste test that.
Yeah, well, it's again, I feel like that initial mix that we make with the chili and like that's where a lot of the flavor comes from. And again, something like that garam masala, you know, this is something I would highly recommend adding to your kitchen pantry. It's used in a lot of dishes. Again, it's a perfect blend of a lot of different spices. You know, instead of buying a bottle of clove, a bottle of cardamom, a bottle of, you know, all these other spices, you know, it comes together. Again, it's not the same as, you know, freshly preparing it every single time, but, you know, I certainly don't have the time to do so. And I think, you know, for most people, it's the level of difference in flavor is maybe not that significant.
Mm-hmm. Now, is this something that you could batch cook and freeze the leftovers? Will it maintain the flavor?
Yeah. So again, actually, this is what we did earlier in the week, and that's exactly what we did. So we cooked a batch just to make sure everything was good, and then put it in the fridge or freezer. So it'll last. I wouldn't leave it in there for more than a month. You could definitely, you may be able to go more. One of the wonderful things, right, if you think about Indian food and a lot of food, the spices that are used, you know, it's, again, there's that inherent nutritional value, but there's also this protective you know, value from the spices. That's why Indian food, for instance, evolved to include all of these spices. It was how could people, you know, earlier civilizations prepare food and have it last in a high heat, high humidity, where there's, you know, possibility for food going bad. The spices do exactly that. So I would say that it would should last a pretty long time. And if all else fails, that good old smell test does the trick.
Right.
You don't want it shouldn't be sour. It shouldn't smell pungent. It should still remain, you know, retain that aroma that you have when you cook it fresh.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Varun, for demonstrating another quality dish that just makes us salivate.
Yeah, of course. And you know what I should do? I'll find a couple of brands of the chana dal or the roasted chickpea, and see when, you know, where we could find them more easily, so that people can get a hold of them.
Wonderful. And then I will send that out in an email to everyone. So once again, thank you, Varun. That concludes our demonstration for today. And I'd like to remind you that we have an ongoing web series. And this was part of our Asian Pacific American Heritage Month cooking demo series, and we have 2 more coming up, so we hope that you'll return for those. Tomorrow night, we have a What the Health watch party and a talk back with Dr. Michael Clapper. So feel free to join us for that event. We have another cooking demonstration with Chef Carol Levi, who is our culinary educator, and she'll be also demonstrating some delicious salt, oil, sugar-free dishes. And please sign up for our newsletter. If you haven't, you can visit our website, www.ppmny.org, to find additional upcoming events. And thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.
Thanks, Varun. That was
Yep.
great. Thanks, Nivi. Vivi.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, Rabbi Joe. Thank you for your questions. I will be sending out the recipes to those who have not received it, so please let me know. You can shoot me an email at vivian@ppmny.org as well. All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.